This week on Dialogue, cut or spend? What's the long-term solution to America's budget challenge? Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guests this week are Catherine Lavelle and Kent Hughes. Catherine Lavelle is Ellen and Dixon Long Associate Professor of World Affairs at Case Western Reserve University. Professor Lavelle is a former Woodrow Wilson Center Fellow. Kent Hughes is Director of the Wilson Center's Program on America and the Global Economy, and also of the Wilson Center on the Hill program. Kent, Katie, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having us, John.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with a sort of a word association. U.S. economy. Characterize it. Where is it right now, Katie?
Well, in transition. I don't know if I'm allowed to have two words or not,
you
but
can use more
I would say in transition. You know, when we think about the financial crisis, I think we've seen it unfold in waves. And the first wave was the housing crisis in the United States. The second part of it would have been the broader recession in the global economy. But right now we're seeing these episodic collapses in European economies with respect to the sovereign debt. And all of this will have an effect on the American economy that really still hasn't come to its final resolution.
Is this a transition from industrial age to information age? Is it that big a transition, or is it more finite than that?
Well, I think it is an awfully big transition, and it's also an institutional transition. Like in political science, we like to think about what institutions are being transformed at the national and the international level. So if we think about the international level, we see a completely different role for the IMF coming out of this crisis, and even with each sovereign debt crisis, a different way that the IMF has involved itself. We see a new European Union coming out in the international part. But what we're also seeing on the American side is the whole outstanding question of what will happen to our domestic financial institutions. And the two big ones there that we need to watch are Fannie and Freddie, the government-sponsored enterprises. Because until that is ultimately resolved, we won't really know what the future of housing markets are going forward for the next generation.
Kent, you've had a chance to listen, but still get back to the quick association. When you think U.S. economy, what's your first association?
Struggling.
Struggling.
And it's struggling, much as Katie said, it's struggling domestically. It really goes even beyond, I would say, the Fannie and Freddie question, which is very serious for the housing industry, which is a big part of the economy. But you can look really at the unemployment rate, 9%, even with robust job formation in the private sector, that there are so many people sitting on the sidelines that we could see robust job growth for quite a long period of time and yet be stuck at something like a 9%. So we need to think more creatively about long-term job creation. And part of that goes back to this restructuring that Katie mentioned, this idea of it's not fully a transition from one period to another, because really the industrial age had already become transformed itself. That really started with the Japanese challenge in the 1980s. But we clearly have more work to do on that front. Internationally, the world has changed not only in terms of new roles for international institutions, but the rise of the so-called emerging market countries, the BRICS, which now are formally the BRICS, including South Africa. This has changed the way international fora work. It has changed the opportunities for America. It's changed the challenges that we face. China, in particular, has developed an effective mingling of state and private sector, state and markets, that creates a set of challenge for a country like us who has traditionally and continues to rely largely on private institutions.
Now, transition, struggling, those things often go together. If I had framed the question differently, if I had asked you to characterize the global economy, would the answer be much different or slightly different? You've both invoked international comparisons.
Well, when we look to the international economy, we look to the emerging markets, or what we used to call emerging markets, and some of us are starting to say they've emerged. We look for the growth to come from the countries like Brazil and India, which is different than in past crises where the United States has kind of emerged as the demander in the world economy. But I agree with what Ken is saying, and one thing I would add to the struggling aspect of that is that a lot of times we don't see this because we're looking for these analogies from the Great Depression, or we're using numbers and we're using statistics. But one thing that we've learned in the last 50 years is that poverty looks very different in the United States than it used to. So we look at these black and white pictures of the Great Depression and we say, well, we're not in the breadlines. We don't have these sad-looking people. But the reality is that the people now who are struggling are people who have access to machine-produced goods that come in from the global south or from the third world. So they actually have clothes. They don't kind of have torn clothes like they did in the Great Depression. The other big difference is that they tend to have...
So does that serve to mask the amount of economic suffering?
I think we don't see it around us. We're not as aware of it when we walk down the street. We don't see that these are people who are struggling. And also, we don't see them hungry. We see people who now are obese, as opposed to being very thin like they did in the 30s and the 40s.
Katie's response, Kent, makes me think of the old military adage about always fighting the last war.
There's a danger of that, no question. I think one of the things that's different is that we learned a lot of lessons from the Great Depression. So what economists call automatic stabilizers, like unemployment compensation, didn't exist. In fact, there was virtually no federal safety net at all. There was charity, and there were a few state programs. Otherwise, you were on your own. Now, one of the debates that's going on right now is how to adjust or expand or reduce that safety net. Healthcare, pensions, unemployment compensation. Some proposals for deficit reduction really target these programs and say we've got to cut back on them. Other people are saying, well, wait a minute. In the long run, we really need to expand these programs, but rationalize them. Everyone recognizes, as Katie was saying, looking at the longer term, we face the baby boom retiring. That's going to put a burden on public finances. Healthcare costs continue to rise at some multiple of the rate of inflation. You put those two together, more people using more expenses, and you see healthcare costs moving really beyond what is probably reasonable for a government to pay for. What's the answer? I think we have to go back and really take a look at healthcare costs. Do what Federal Express did one time when it won the Baldrige Award. Looked at every single step along the way. Where are those costs, and how can we take them out without reducing coverage?
And the president's health care plan does or doesn't do that?
The president's health care plan takes a solid step toward universal coverage, which I think is important for several reasons. But I didn't see a major, really, approach to health care cost reduction. There's hopes that the changes will reduce costs. Other deficits, I'm thinking of Mr. Ryan's proposal. He's chair of the House Budget Committee, has a very ambitious deficit reduction proposal. He is hoping that by putting more responsibility on individual consumers will reduce costs. That's unproven. I think we need a more ambitious, more thoughtful, more systemic approach to cost reduction.
Some observers say here that there's no proven model for reducing costs in the way Kent's suggesting needs to happen other than a single payer.
But healthcare is key, because when we look to the costs of the United States participating in the global economy, we can expect people to change jobs, to lose jobs more frequently. And losing your job, or maybe having to work in a job that you don't consider to be what you had expected when you got out of college for a period of time, means something very different when you lose access to healthcare. And so as we go forward and we move further and further into a globalized economy where production processes are globalized, where we can't just pull back and say, well, we're going to do it on our own and be isolationist, we really have to get access to people.
What does the evidence suggest, though, as far as economic models for containing healthcare costs? Is there a way? I'm not coming at this with an opinion, but everything I read suggests that the single payer is a proven way to keep costs down, but that was rejected even by the president,
If you look around the world, there are several different models, and you're getting really beyond what I know enough about. But the French and the Swiss have a model that's more like ours. Japanese have lots of insurance companies. England has a totally public system. Canada is a bit like that. So we ought to be able to look at these different models and say, what could we learn from them and what might work here?
And what prevents us from doing that?
Well, I would agree with what Ken said, but we also have to look at the models in the political context and the political culture.
That's, I guess, what I was getting
and
at
the British. And we have a political culture here in the United States that values the rights of the individual to make decisions about their own behavior. And so what we would have to do is enter into decisions that people make about smoking and healthy food choices to really contain costs in the long term that probably isn't politically sustainable.
We try to do that. Our anti-obesity campaign from Michelle Obama, certainly the anti-smoking campaign has been widespread and persistent.
And there's been pushback on those issues. But also having an anti-obesity campaign and telling people that they can't eat at McDonald's are two very different things.
Right.
Or forcing them to pay a higher cost for their health care or something if they choose to do that.
This notion of crisis, this word that we use to describe probably too many things, but maybe not out of place in this particular. I'm wondering, I wrote a list of words here to myself. What is the crisis, to ask you? Is it a debt crisis, a deficit crisis, an employment crisis, a revenue crisis? Now, is it a cultural crisis based on what we just talked about? How would you, if you were trying to isolate the main problem that needs to be addressed, where is the crisis? Is it a health care cost crisis?
I'm going to fall back on the vision word. I think it's a vision and strategy crisis that we haven't settled.
So what kind of country do we want to be?
That's what I'm really getting at. That in terms of the safety net, one of the thoughts that's occurred to me is that we can't build a city on the hill and leave a lot of people in the valley. That there has to be a degree of universality, a degree of community within the context, as Katie says, of a country that prides its self-reliance, which is a great strength. That's why you, in a way, you have a Silicon Valley with people willing to take lots of risks. But I think we need that bigger discussion, because we shouldn't be looking just with our green eye shade at how to trim this from the budget and so forth. The budget should be an expression of national priorities, and we need to have that kind of conversation.
All trees, no forest. That's what's going on right now.
And maybe a lot of leaves.
And a lot of leaves, even down into that minutia. Do we see examples? Is this, again, is this an exportable discussion? Does the whole world need to have this discussion right now? Or is America an outlier in some way?
Part of the problem that we have is that we're in a unique position in the global economy as Americans. And when we talk about the kinds of things that Kent is talking about, where we want to include everyone and bring everyone along, they're nationalistic ideas. So we have a certain group of people who might think of themselves more as citizens of Davos than citizens of the United States. We have other people who feel like they've been left out and they've been marginalized from the American political process. But when we talk about pulling everyone in, we have the effect sometimes of threatening other countries in the world who perceive this as American nationalism in a way that I think other countries don't have to deal with. When the Greeks talk about how to get out of the Greek debt crisis, or the Irish talk about how to get out of the Irish debt crisis, and that's a very unique problem that we have in the United States, and one that we have to address going forward.
Kent mentioned Paul Ryan's budget reduction plan, which has been the subject of all kinds of reviews, not necessarily positive in all cases, not necessarily negative. The other side of the equation, the Democratic response seems to be sort of a me too. We think we need to cut too, just not as much as you, or not in the same places as you. If you were looking to where the fulcrum is and what the two debates are, maybe columnist Paul Krugman has been the most vigorous voice about stimulus, spend more, spend more. This is not a time to cut. What is your assessment of this notion of stimulate the economy, create jobs through government spending, the Paul Krugman approach versus the Paul Ryan approach? I know there are other people associated with these theories, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll call it the two Pauls.
Well, I'm a political scientist, so in addition to looking at the economic side of things,
the politics loom large.
I would say that economists teach us you can stimulate an economy in two ways. You can look at the monetary policy, which is the Federal Reserve and how much is out there in the money supply. You can look at fiscal policy, which are the issues that you're talking about. But as a political scientist, I have to say, what is politically sustainable right here and right now? And politically, fiscal policy is very difficult to get through the current arrangement that we have in Washington.
Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, see this log jam we're in. We go from one standoff to the next.
I'm also a professor, and the light at the end of the tunnel for me is when my students look out. Right? My book is. I got tenure. Yeah, I know. When I get promoted, we all that's out on the table. But we have to look at a future where I see my students, and they have possibilities and opportunities to raise a family, live comfortably in a broad sector of the United States, not just on the coast or in certain places, and the possibilities opportunities are not concentrated in the financial sector. As much as I don't want to criticize the job opportunities in the financial sector, we have to see other careers as viable possibilities and alternatives for good, solid middle-class jobs. That students coming out of Midwestern universities with great grades, and they see a really positive future. And unfortunately, that structure is not in place right now.
Kent, the sober assessment, evidence-based, of the Paul v. Paul world of views on how to fix this economy.
Well, I would borrow from one of Katie's insights, which is the world has changed since the Great Depression. And while stimulus will do certain things, if hypothetically the housing market had hit bottom and you stimulated, you'd get more housing and you'd put a lot of construction workers back to work. Or if you did a little more targeted, let's say we really had this version of a green economy. We said we're going to make an enormous effort to retrofit the existing housing and commercial building stock to make it much more energy efficient. That would put a lot of currently unemployed people with existing skills to work. But I think there's another angle here that isn't quite Paul versus Paul. It's that we really have to make sure that we're doing those critical investments in the future, in education, in a variety of infrastructures, both 20th and 21st century, and certainly investing in innovation, which means
Is that government investment, private investment, or both?
Oh, it's going to be both, I think, but you absolutely, there are elements here where you're simply not going to can't expect the private sector to be putting money into very risky scientific research. They don't know what the payoff is going to be. There might be a terrific payoff that helps the industry down the street. So that's a quintessential government kind of role. Look at the pharmaceutical industry as an example of how partnerships work together. The government often, or the public often, pays for the scientific research. You've got top companies with an applied research capacity. Then you have the community colleges who are preparing the technicians who work with the biomedical engineers. And you've got the FDA, which facilitates a trusted move to the market. So it's not so much market or government, it's getting all these right pieces in place, and these pieces are in part the product of past investments.
You know, I'm starting to feel a little Bud Abbott, Lou Costello here, you know, the who's on first going around in a circle, because your answer, Ken, gets us back to politics. What you describe is a very reasonable little of this, a little of that. And that doesn't seem to be where the current political debate is. It's either socialism or social Darwinism, but there seems to be nothing in between. Is bleak? Can we just stop now and put our hands in our heads?
I think, I'm going to quote Charlie Schultz, who was President Carter's advisor and Lyndon Johnson's advisor.
Okay, not peanuts.
No,
anyway,
not that. Although this has an element of that. I thought one of his many insights was that the budget deficit at that time was not a wolf at the door that demanded action. It was termites in the woodwork. So I'm, being a country boy from Oregon, always hopeful about the future. I think the exaggerated claims and so forth are part of a process that will bring us to make reasonable cuts, put ourselves on the path, not just ideally to a sustainable level of debt and deficit, but really to a point where we, like Canada, can run a fiscal surplus that will allow us to start paying down the debt, while at the same time we're making investments that drive growth, which is one of the best sources of added revenue.
What does the Tea Party factor have to do with this? Because again, there are things that are different. Some things just appear different, but there are things that are different. And what I'm wondering, in the equation that you just described, is the Tea Party an X factor that makes that kind of behind the facade deal possible?
But you know, the Tea Party is a great thing to bring up here, because one thing I find fascinating is that in the United States, the grassroots movement for budget cutting at the national level is for budget cutting, I should say, at the national level, and maybe not at the state level. In Europe, it's the exact opposite. The grassroots movement is to stop the budget cutting. And we have such a varied economy in different parts of the country, and we have such a varied a number of political participants. Despite a lot of what you see on the news and all, I'm pretty optimistic that we'll come to some good solution in the long run.
Let me bring up another taboo subject in this town, the tax increases. Another way to address the problem is to increase revenue. Some would argue that we have a revenue crisis. I've read some recent figures. The tax levels are here in 2011 about the same as they were in 1957 or 58. Is that part of the solution? Is that part of what eventually must be done? Do we have to raise taxes somewhere, somehow, on somebody?
Well, we have to have a serious discussion in this country about where it is appropriate to tax people. So maybe what we have to do is just have a national day where no one can talk about tax cutting in either political party, and everyone has to come out and say, even the most libertarian person would argue that there are some functions the government has to perform, and that they need revenue. And where is this money supposed to come from? And then build from that. Where is it appropriate? It can't just be working Americans who are taxed.
Why does the perception that we are so heavily taxed when the figures indicate otherwise?
I've never met an individual that pounded the table and said, why don't they tax me
Why don't
more?
they increase my taxes?
It's just, it's such a natural and ingrained kind of reaction. On the other hand, you look at local elections where they identify what the tax is going for, maybe for education, rebuild the bridge, you need a new whatever it is, then there's a great deal more support than for the kind of abstraction of taxes, which often boils down to the way the federal taxes look to people. And I think one of the elements, I'm going to shift just a minute if I could, one of the elements that isn't talked about in all the debt and deficit and so forth are the current account deficits that we've run, the borrowing from the rest of the world. We talk about borrowing from the future, we're not talking about borrowing internationally, which has had a negative impact on our industrial base, which is part of our innovation and innovative capacity. And it's had real foreign policy implications as countries around the world have acquired these enormous hard currency reserves, a lot of which are dollars. So I think when we talk about taxes, we might even have to think about the kind of things that we really haven't talked much about. If we can find a progressive way to do it, a fair way to do it, we may have to think about consumption taxes, which are more similar to the rest of the world. That part of this
replacing the graduated income tax system with
perhaps supplementing it.
Perhaps
a VAT tax would be perhaps a supplement. You might want to keep the aspects of the income tax as a way of preserving.
What are the advantage? What's the advantage of that type of system, Kent?
Well, there's two. First of all, you are shifting the burden away from your tradable goods sector. That is the companies that really compete with China and Germany and Japan and so forth. And we've set up a system under the global trade rules, which we helped create and to which we have been the major champion. We set up a system where at the border, if you have an indirect tax, like a consumption tax, you get to rebate it at the border. And if you import something, then you add that tax on. In a world of flexible exchange rates, economists would say, well, this will all go away. But in fact, we've seen that that's not the way the world works, that in fact currencies can be part of a competitive strategy too. So I think this is the one way we can move in that direction to strengthen over time our industrial sector and at the same time reduce this dependence on this financial dependence on the rest of the world in a way that still allows us to stay within the world that we, in fact, ourselves have built.
Let me ask you about a contemporary issue of the debt limit and raising the debt limit. What are your expectations on how this is going to play out?
Oh, I would.
Luckily, we have a political scientist.
Well, it is a political question more than a math question, I think.
I think we're going to be fine on that one. But remember, you know, the bigger issue here is that we have, again, this political culture where we have a constitution that tells us all the things that the government can't do. That's how we got the Bill of Rights through. And Americans like to have these discussions about all the things the government can't do. But generally, I guess I would be pretty optimistic that when the rubber hits the road, the government does do what it has to do.
Well, in our closing minutes, I want to ask both of you to sort of a suggested reading list. You know, I mean, I came to Kent with the idea for having this discussion, and then we called on our old friend Katie to join us. And part of it is trying to, as a public service for our viewers and listeners, try to sort through these difficult issues. Where do you turn for unvarnished, reliable information on the economy that isn't tainted by partisan ideology trying to get you to one conclusion or another? Where do you go?
Well, I guess I turn to kind of people who are out and about in Cleveland, but what do you think about the economy and kind of get their views who are away from a university, but I mean kind of more statistical evidence? Obviously, I would go to the more, I guess, the mainstream news sources.
But are there trustworthy places where we could look at budget projections and things like that?
I think the Congressional Budget Office is by and large respected. I think OMB is respected. I think the data that comes out of the Commerce Department and the Census Bureau and so forth are really viewed as quite reliable.
Even though there's been a little more political jockeying over those in recent times than in the past?
Well, I don't think there's been more. There was
That's always the case.
There was quite a, well, no, there was quite a concern that people were not giving tax cuts their full due by looking at the sort of dynamic impact of them. But people have now looked at that dynamic impact and found that it wasn't really as large as people thought it might be. So I don't think you see politically motivated attacks on the Congressional Budget Office.
But remember, these are all aggregate. These are big picture numbers, and we live in regional economies. So even what's going on in Cleveland and Detroit aren't necessarily the same picture. So while the national news might give us one picture, we care about we care about the people we live with and we interact with, and an awful lot of these people and what we see with the housing in Las Vegas and Florida and other places, it's a very different picture. So I think that many times more local sources can be very helpful to unpack what's going on at the national level.
The Federal Reserve does this beige book, and they look at these regional economies, but it gets, unless you're kind of really a total Fed follower, it doesn't get much attention. So it would be very useful to have a report from Cleveland, from Las Vegas, which just was a disaster for the housing industry, or maybe for Seattle, which seems to be doing okay. So all that, it would be useful to see that variety because it suggests that maybe one single national initiative might not be enough to reach each of these problem areas.
When I began this conversation, I had no way of knowing that Cleveland would be the ultimate answer to all of our problems. Ken, Katie, thank you for joining us.
Thank
you for having us, John.
Thank you for watching and listening as well, and we'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thank you.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.
Next week on Dialogue.
Virtually all, the number's close to 90% now, of Latinos under the age of 18 living in the United States are native-born citizens of the United States. Now what that means is that the size of the Latino electorate over the next 18 years will essentially double, even if not a single additional immigrant crosses the international frontier, not a single immigrant here naturalizes to U.S. citizenship.